kind of the power of community organizing and how people have come together, where there are challenges, and we're very excited to have this discussion in our second in our series of Zionism Today, Tomorrow, and Beyond, expanding the conversation. My name is Ellie Gettinger. I'm the Director of Outreach for the Center for Lifelong Learning at JTS. Throughout this series, we're having faculty sharing their thoughts based on the conference that we had last month, the convening. This convening looked at that topic of Zionism Today, Tomorrow, and Beyond, and broke it down in a number of different areas, including today's area around pluralism and how we can explore the kind of challenges post-October 7th, but also find kind of commonalities. What are the ways in which we aren't building bridges? What are the ways that we as American Jews are supporting Israel? What are the ways that that's helpful and it's not? And I'm very excited to have two people who have extensive experience in this process to talk through what they're seeing on the ground and how this is impacting both government structures, individuals, community broadly. Today, I want to welcome all of my newcomers to this session. I also want to thank our sponsors. If you are interested in making a sponsorship, we have 3 levels. This is a great opportunity to honor a loved one or to commemorate a specific anniversary, and there'll be information about that in the chat. The conversation today will be recorded, so you can always, if you have to leave, you can find more information on that also in the chat where to find our information. Our speakers today are Rabbi Ayelet Cohen. She's the Pearl Resnick Dean of the Rabbinical School and the Dean of Dean of the Division of Religious Leadership at JTS. Rabbi Cohen leads the Rabbinical School and the H.L. Miller Cantorial School. Prior to joining JTS, she was the spiritual leader at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, the world's largest LGBTQ synagogue. Rabbi Cohen also served as the senior director of the New Israel Fund in New York, and she was the inaugural director of the Center for Jewish Living and the David H. Sonnabend Center for Israel at the Marlene Meyerson Jewish Community Center in Manhattan. She is joined by Shira Ben-Sasson Furstenberg, who is the Associate Director at the New Israel Fund and the Director of Development and International Relations Department there. She previously served as the Director of the Jewish Pluralism Watch for the Masorti Movement. She worked for IREP, the Israel Religious Expression Platform at the Jewish Federations of North America, and she worked at the Knesset's Research and Information Center. So we have 2 people with extensive experience in engaging Israel and pluralism specifically in Israel. So I am delighted to turn it over to them. They will be in conversation. At the end of their discussion, we'll have some time for Q&A, so you can send your questions to me. If you have a technical question, please reach out to my colleague, Tani Schwartz-Herman, and she can hopefully help you with that. Thanks so much for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Cohen and Shira Ben-Sasson Furstenberg.
Hi, everybody. It's so good to be with you today. And Shira, it's so great to see you. I just want to ask you a question that should be a simple question, but is such a loaded question in these moments, which is, how are you and how's your family?
We're okay. That's glad to be. We're very privileged. We're okay. You know, it's not this way for many families, even on my street, even, you know, in my extended family and friends. But we're safe. Yerushalayim is safe. If people are considering whether or not to travel and to visit, Jerusalem is safe most of the time. So thank God, and not to be taken for granted. Thank you. We're okay.
Well, I'm coming in a couple weeks, so I hope we get to see each other in person. You know, so much of what we are hearing right now about what's going on among Israelis, and especially among different stripes of religiously affiliated Israelis. On the one hand, we hear about so much bifurcation, about the conflict around the legislation around Haredi conscription. We hear that life is so different if you're religious, if you're secular. And on the other hand, and I know what the last time I was in Israel, I saw this, and I see this in everybody's pictures. Everywhere you go, there are these billboards that say, B'yachad nenatzeach, together we will be victorious. Together we will win. So what's going on? How much is really separate and how much is really everyone is coming together in such a difficult time?
So I can tell you what it's like for us, and maybe later you can tell me what it's like for you. The first few weeks and even months after October 7th happened, the words "together we shall be victorious" felt inappropriate, but not as inappropriate as they feel today, because at least in the beginning we could have a small, somewhat limited feeling of beyachadness, of togetherness, because people who were showing up to help, we were all, volunteering, maybe some of the people on this call too, and I'm sure your family and friends, volunteering from day to night based on what you felt you could do, cook or drive or pick. I myself picked avocados, and people were everywhere doing everything, baking and cooking for soldiers and for people who've been evacuated from their homes. And there was a short period of a honeymoonish kind of togetherness that Israelis, so I've learned that Israelis sometimes are able to generate around times of crisis and in times of war. But even from the beginning, from the first days when it started, when we were in it and it was happening to us and everything was so overwhelming, the words "Beyachad nenatzeach," together we shall be victorious, didn't make sense because we were already not victorious by 10 a.m. on Shabbat, October 7th. Selling this make-believe or unreal feeling of victory, I don't feel is helpful to where we are at. And it's become worse because it's being used by some people in this country as sort of an excuse to postpone the end of the war or discuss real goals, realistic goals. Victory feels like, don't talk to us about victory. Talk to us about life. Talk to us about direction. Talk to us about, rehabilitation, surviving this, rebuilding. But victory feels like it's from a different time and a different place. And already now, over a year later, beyachad, together, also feels like it's from a different time and a different place, especially when it's being chanted by people whose commitment to being together with people like me or people who believe and think and act like me feels unreal. I wonder, I've been in the US once or twice since the war broke, and on Shabbat, I happened to be downtown at a hotel downtown for a New Israel Fund board meeting. And the synagogue we went to said they're organizing a march every Shabbat afternoon around Union Square and University Square and in that area, the neighborhoods and their names better. And they walk together, people of all denominations, different rabbis from different synagogues lead this walk every Shabbat. And I was really proud to take part in it and to walk together, with women rabbis and men rabbis and people from different congregations. And it seemed like something that is far from reach sometimes for us here. And I wonder if it's representative of how you've been experiencing community and differences since October 7th for you.
I think similarly, there are moments of really profound togetherness and moments of alienation and loneliness, and we're trying to balance it in those first terrible, terrible days after October 7th, when the news was still coming in and we were so stunned and so scared and so much grieving. I live on the Upper West Side in New York City, and our community has a really lovely tradition of coming together for certain moments across denominations. And we do that on Yom HaShoah. We do a reading of the names communally, a 24-hour reading of the names. And in those early days, we did come together just a day or two later, and so many of the rabbis and cantors from the Upper West Side came together at Congregation Anshe Chesed, a big conservative show on the Upper West Side, for a service of prayer and mourning and strength. And the building was packed to the rafters. There were more people standing outside, and people really kind of understood what was called for in the moment, which was no speeches, no political agendas, no anybody trying to assert that they were the ones with the answer. We all knew we had no answers. It was just prayer. People offered Tehillim, Psalms, they offered prayers of mourning, of hope, of healing, and everybody was together in that space. And that was extremely powerful and extremely healing. And a similar group got together for the Shloshim at another Upper West Side congregation. And so those are moments that feel very, very meaningful when we can look past the things that separate us and come together. There are a lot of moments that don't feel like that. Every Sunday in New York, there are different opportunities to focus on the hostages and to lift up that situation. Each one, I think, with a little bit of a different feeling. There's in Central Park every Sunday, there's a big gathering to tell stories of hostages and to advocate. Then there's a couple of hours later, there's a gathering, which is, they call themselves Kaplan in New York, to kind of connect to the protests in Tel Aviv and elsewhere in Israel. And people come often from the hostage rally with signs, with flags, Israeli flags, but it's very critical of the current Israeli government. Then further downtown, there's another gathering later in the day, which is a Stop the War protest. No flags are allowed of any kind, no, and that's the unifying message. And then there's yet another protest elsewhere, which is even more critical of Israel. And you definitely see some people going to more than one, some people going to just one, trying to figure out the place to pour their grief, their anger, their hope, their concern, all of those kinds of things. And I actually wanted to ask you, Shira, because I think that even the advocacy for hostages has a different flavor in the US as it does in Israel right now. In the US, that's kind of the rallying call of the American Jewish community. Regardless of where people are on the political spectrum, the focus on reaching a deal to bring the hostages home is top of mind everywhere you go in the organized Jewish community. And that's in some ways kind of the most important kind of key to membership and connection with the Jewish people right now, and certainly with Israel. I've been seeing so many different kinds of hostage protests in Israel. Can you talk a little bit about what that's like?
Yeah, I'm sorry to say that for us, and for a while now, the issue of the hostages and identifying and keeping it on public agenda and wanting a deal at any cost has become a deeply, deeply politicized and polarizing issue. And that's probably one of the most painful things about this past year, is the way certain people were able to penetrate the hostage family forum and create differences of opinion and direction within the actual group of the families of the hostages, and break it into subgroups and groups who work with the government, are willing to believe the government and others who are critical of what's going on. And I will say this, I belong to a congregation that's bereaved. My synagogue is Hirsch Goldberg Poland's synagogue here in Baka in Jerusalem. Rachel and John Goldberg Poland, who some of you might know from, you know, their life in the US before they became famous, and some of you might know because sadly, tragically, they became so famous. Rachel and John live at the end of my street and are friends and members of my congregation. And we have spent the past year deeply invested in, like you said, coming together in prayer and using our presence as a congregation that can organize services in our synagogue and in the public sphere, and to invite other congregations to be with us, to speak for Hirsch and for the others. And we've taken upon ourselves, a number of people from our shul. We are in Baka, the hostage family tent encampment is near the Prime Minister's residence in Rehavia. It's like a, I don't know, 30 to 40 minute walk. We have committed to have a Friday night service, Kabbalat Shabbat, every Friday night after candle lighting at the tent, at the hostage family tent on Balfour Street in Jerusalem. And it is appalling to me that when we're there davening, Kabbalat Shabbat, no loudspeakers. It's a very somber Friday night prayer, few dozens, sometimes over 100 people, very quiet and organized. People drive by and yell, Rak Bibi. And you know what? Fine, you maybe vote differently than I do. And, you know, you maybe think that he's the best prime minister and I don't. And it's not even about that. But the fact that a presence, a Jewish presence, a quiet Friday night service in a place where families are sitting concerned and worried for their loved ones has become something that magnetizes and attracts a political violent response, a disrespectful political violent response, is something that I can't fathom. And I want to quote Rachel and John. And John wrote in a very in a leading central Israeli sort of mainstream right-wing Jewish newspaper, Makor Rishon, saying to the Jewish community, saying to National Zionists, saying to people from the sort of modern Orthodox community, I don't hear you. I don't see you. The rabbis, the modern Orthodox National Zionist rabbis, where are they? Why are they saying that halachically maybe a deal is not a high priority, and getting into sort of like, you know, your dean of rabbinics, you can explain better how halacha considers the idea of pidyon shvuim, of freeing our hostages, and what kind of a price a community needs to pay, and what does it mean for the future of future hostages and all that. But I mean, really, I don't want to sit here and list all the Jewish values and halachic legal priorities that make sense to me. It's just very hard to see that it's become an issue that polarizes us, and that is used as or that Jewish values and Jewish law is used to justify things that I find atrocious. First and foremost, not reaching a hostage deal, and not so far second, and this is me, and I know other people might think otherwise, not allowing food and medicine to go into Gaza, and aid, humanitarian aid, again, using Jewish justification and being led by people with the most Jewish appearance is a big chilul Hashem for me, is a big act of sacrilege, in my opinion, when you choose sides and you give it a traditional Torah-based sort of justification that hurts the most. And I know that you, as Jewish leaders, have been trying to bring a different message, and not for the first time, by the way, when Israel is prioritizing or creating policies and using Jewish language and Jewish justification to explain it. And for us, it's a Jewish state. Everything is sort of painted with this, especially with this governing coalition. What kind of, like, as someone who is a rabbi herself and who's training the next generation of rabbis and who is involved in many rabbinical contexts and responses, how do you see the role of moderate Jewish leaders vis-a-vis this polarization and hijacking, I'm sorry to say, of the Jewish message?
I think that's such an important question, Shira. And when I see examples of that on both sides of the ocean, those are some of the few moments where I feel hope, where I see people leaning on Jewish values and Jewish learning and Jewish text to try to do something productive and not divisive. So, you mentioned the halakha, the Jewish law around pidyon shvuim, around freeing the captive. That is a concept that I think many contemporary Jews had not spent a lot of time thinking about or learning about. And many of us have really taken the time in our communities. Certainly we have here, and I would imagine many listeners have seen that in your home communities, to really study, what do the sources say? We might have thought that we were in a time in history where this was not such a relevant contemporary question. It turns out it is absolutely an extremely relevant and contemporary question. And Jewish tradition, Jewish sources have a lot to teach us about that Jewish value. And then we layer on top of that contemporary understanding and considerations. And that's the way that we approach some of these questions from a Jewish learning perspective. Another piece that I think has been very relevant is liturgy. The prayer for the hostages is something that has become part of the regular liturgy of every community I have davened in or visited in the last year, in Israel, in the US. It is, these were words where originally a lot of people were tripping over the Hebrew because we weren't used to pronouncing some of these words. And now we say them, we've said them so many times, and we thought we were taking them on in a very temporary, short way. We never would have thought we would still be saying this prayer every day, more than 400 days later. And so even in synagogues where there's a tremendous amount of liturgical and musical diversity in other ways across movements, this is now part of the liturgy in so many synagogues across the denominations, and is so much an expression. And I really believe that that's what liturgy is. It teaches us about the values of our community, teaches us, what do we care about? What are we praying for? What are we devoting that precious time in any given service to say out loud? These are the prayers that are the top of our minds. And we've spent a lot of time at JTS, and we've done this with students as well, studying different girsa'ot, different versions of some of these prayers for hostages, of prayers for IDF soldiers, of prayers for the state of Israel, and looking at new additions and new suggestions that are used by different communities in different sidurim in the US and in Israel to expand our understanding of what is at the heart of so many, the longing of so many Jews. One thing I've seen in your neighborhood, and I would imagine for a lot of people on this call, your neighborhood of Baka, Emek Rephaim is a familiar neighborhood. A lot of American Jews who like to come and daven in Jerusalem, float between the different places. You yourself come from a more Orthodox background. Of course, you have strong connections to the Masorti movement. Your synagogue is open and traditional at the same time. I've seen so many gatherings of synagogues, rabbis, communities from different stripes of religious life in Jerusalem and elsewhere coming together to pray for the hostages. In the Masorti movement, the Israeli conservative movement is part of organizing daily tefillah at the hostage square in Tel Aviv. And I had the real honor of joining my colleagues, Rabbi Chaya Baker and Rabbi Aryeh Hasid, who run the rabbinical school at Machon Shechter in Jerusalem, our conservative movement rabbinical school, and be a part of leading that tefillah when I was last in Israel. And it's been so moving to see that there is religious language, there's prayer, there is shared religious leadership in those spaces. Were those relationships between those communities things that existed before this? Have they gotten stronger during this time?
I can only speak for Baca, which is like a nature reserve in Israel, and I think maybe similar in a way to the Upper West Side, or maybe to Riverdale, or if people live in other places and know a reality of real pluralism and relationship between different congregations. In sorrow, we have had each other to lean on. And everybody has been with us. We have done, Rachel and Don dedicated a Sefer Torah when Hirsch was still alive, and everybody was there for the dedication. And you know, we were out in the rain and in the heat of summer, and everybody's come. And we've also participated. Kol HaNeshama adopted Karina Arayev, one of the women soldiers who have been kidnapped.
And that's a Reform synagogue.
And it's a Reform synagogue, and one of the staff of the synagogue is Karina's cousin, and there's a huge sign of her beautiful face on the outside wall of the synagogue and facing everybody who's driving by. It's a very central spot in our neighborhood. And when they've held Havdalah on Saturday night, ceremony around her birthday and such, we came as a congregation to participate with them. And I think the thing that most depicts, it's a small thing, but and terrible to be part of, but we had this terrible opportunity to pay it forward, because after Hirsch was murdered, a different congregation, Klausner, who's also a partnership Orthodox Minyan synagogue a little bit further up in the Talpiot neighborhood, which is the one next to us, called us up and said, it's not just the Goldberg Poland family who's bereaved, it's your entire congregation. And we know how you've all managed through the Shiva and through this past almost year that you've been waiting for him. And they baked cakes. They baked dozens and dozens of cakes. I can show a picture of 2 tables packed with home-baked cake that says if they're gluten-free or if they're vegetarian or vegan or milchik or parv or, you know, any kind of thing that you need to know. Home-baked cakes for us in the Shabbat after Hirsch's Shiva. And they came to shul that Shabbat and they said, this is for you, with a beautiful sign from our congregation to your congregation, to all of the families in our congregation. And then a short few weeks later, Rabbi Avi Goldberg, husband of a different Rachel Goldberg. I'm just sitting here talking to you and looking at his balcony, which is, I'm on Makor Chaim 2, and I'm on Makor Chaim 4, and they live on Makor Chaim 2. And he was killed in Lebanon. And his congregation down my street is a little more mainstream, you know, much more mainstream, traditional Orthodox congregation. I've never visited. It's much closer to my house than my synagogue, which I've never visited or never participated at a service there. And we said, it's our time to pay it forward, and it's our time to bake cakes for Rabbi Avi's congregation. And we got our synagogue to bake dozens and dozens of cakes and to add a note and to say it's our time to pay it forward. So from congregation to congregation, we understand the situation of circles of communities carrying the sorrow and the hope and the fear. And, you know, you do what you can. And I want to say it sometimes feels like, you know, being part of people who are not part of a congregation, I think, miss out on so much of this support inside your own synagogue or congregation community, or between different, like you said, different stripes and different communities that are a source of strength and partnership and amplifier of whatever it is you're trying to do. You have your neighboring community helping you to do. And that has been a real help. And I know, I mean, you know, in my professional life, I know that it's not this way for a lot of Israelis. They're not part, you know, we are a minority. Being an observant Jew in Israel means being a minority. For many, many people, if you're not part of a kibbutz or part of a religious movement, you're not part of a congregation. And looking at Israeli society from the sort of my professional perspective and the New Israel Fund perspective, these networks are not always in place. And post-October 7th, we had to think about our role as the supporters of Israeli pro-democratic liberal civil society in places where there isn't such a network to respond.
I'd love to hear about that a little bit more. I mean, you've talked about kind of the micro, the relational, getting to know your neighbors, sometimes people who are right across the street, who you become closer to, sometimes in ways that you never hoped to because of tragedy, and the ways that neighbors are showing up for each other. But in terms of Israeli society, what are the organizations that have kind of come up to help meet this moment and to help, you know, you said before, it's less relevant to talk about victory than to talk about repair. You know, who are the people who are emerging as the ones who are trying to repair some of what has been shattered in Israeli society and in the lives of so many Israelis?
We are the people. You know, it's like they say by you, we are the people. But we've got to remember that October 7th met Israeli civil society when it was already organized and totally out there, because it's been, it met us after a year of challenging response and commitment to struggling and saying no to the democratic crisis and judicial coup that was being presented by our government in 2023, in the entire year prior to October 7th. And when the government didn't show up for all of those places in the Gaza envelope region and in the southern region of Israel, and later on in the northern region of Israel, civil society was showing up. And organizations that already had the know-how and the connection to the field were just using it to replace the government. The New Israel Fund did something that we never do. And we actually bought hotel rooms. We actually called hotels and said, hello, we are the New Israel Fund. Can we pay for 20 rooms for 2 weeks? Can we help house people who can't stay at home because they're in the line of the missiles and the fire? And the Israeli government would later, a month or two later, take on this responsibility. But civil society, progressive philanthropy had to step up and do it. I feel like we have a role to respond to the needs of Israel's most vulnerable communities in times of crisis, and we've learned how to do so in past years. But we also, and we don't want that to be our role, because we're interested, in social change and equality and issues that are not helping the needy. The government should be helping the needy. The government was broken and wasn't there. But I feel like we also have other roles as people who believe in equality and justice in Israel, and that is to look at issues of human rights and what is happening to Israeli democracy, what is happening to Jewish-Arab partnership under the fog of war inside Israel, and also the greatest commitment, or I don't know, I can't prioritize them, but a great commitment. Do we have something to say about a different vision for our region? And the New Israel Fund has been heavily invested since October 7th in imagining and developing and working with organizations, think tanks, and people with experience in what's happening in this region, in laying the lines or the direction for bringing Israel back to the negotiation table, because so many Israelis believe that a military solution on its own is not what's going to save the hostages. We can't do it by military force alone, and we've learned so in terrible instances. And it also is, you can't single-handedly, solve everything in this region only with war and more war. And I remember in 2016, when you had a change in leadership that was difficult and shocking for many people. That after years of us talking about a feeling of shrinking democratic space in Israel and legislation and policies that are hurting our most vulnerable communities around the country, that it became a reality for a lot of people in your communities, an understanding that it's not, an amorphous idea, that democracy and a threat to democracy is something real in your life. Now, I acknowledge that we have over 100 people on this call, and maybe we have differences of opinion also about US politics. But I want to ask you about the role that you see for civic action, whether within the Jewish community or not, in responding to times when you feel that values are being challenged by your own country's administration. If it's okay, and I didn't ask you if it's okay to talk about this, but I know you're in a changing political reality, and it's somewhat similar to the political reality that we're experiencing, and maybe also other countries around the world. So we're not alone in this, but what has it been like for you? What do you think it's going to be like for you?
Well, on a very personal note, I'll say that the day after the election here, I reached out to a bunch of my friends in Israel who are in the civil society and civil rights and human rights community, and said, remind me how we do this. Because this is a time that's really important for us to reach out to each other and not to separate from each other. I think that, yes, we are, many of us are again needing to think about how important the civil society sector, organizations who help further the protection of vulnerable populations, the protection of citizens. And I know, of course, we have a range of people on this call. And so whether it's, an organization like HIAS or National Council for Jewish Women, or, other places that speak to the things that you're particularly concerned about, we know that we're going to be looking to those organizations to help protect the vulnerable and keep moving the progress that we hope we have achieved in difficult times. And the other thing that I think is really important to remember in times like these, and sometimes it's easier to remember than others, is that not all of the citizens of a country vote for its government, and some of the citizens of the country do vote for its government. And the government does not necessarily express the values of every citizen of its country. And that is not a time to turn our backs and run away. And I think there was a time 8 years ago where a lot of Americans who had a lot to say about Israel suddenly remembered, oh, I get it. It might be that the government does not necessarily speak for all of the people. And what we need to do is look towards the people, each of us in our own way, who reflect our concerns and who we can talk to and who are working towards the things that we care about. And so maybe we forgot that in the last 8 years. And so some of us have now been reminded again that it's not the time to abandon the people in a country if you don't like what the government of the country is doing. It is very, very hard to stay engaged with Israel in really painful times. There's so much bad news. And these days, there's a lot of bad news wherever you look. And I completely understand the instinct to want to hide under the covers. That might be self-protective in the short run. It's not going to solve anything in the long run. You know, when we are training here, the next generation of rabbis and cantors in the Rabbinical and Cantorial School and Jewish educators and other Jewish leaders in our other programs, we're trying to give them the tools to come out from under the covers, to figure out how to reach out, how to build connections, how to keep working for the things that we care about. How do we keep caring about democracy? How do we keep making sure that this world is full of safe places for Jews and a place where Jews can lift our voices and teach and share the gifts that we have? And sometimes we have to be reminded, and often those reminders come at a cost.
I want to tell you kol hakavod for that, because I've now learned after 2.5 years of 2 years of ongoing protest. I don't have a Saturday night to myself anymore. It's just not a time that you own and that you can plan. You don't go to concerts and you don't have family events or anything because you're working full-time protesting. That you should have koach, you should have the energy to continue. And I know many people have been asking us, what gives you hope? And, do you have looking forward into something hopeful? And I feel now, for us, and maybe it's similar for you, hope is so far from reach. Hope is so, so far from reach. And sometimes you feel naive or Pollyannish when you're talking about hope. And I have found that action for now, pushback, action, response, having some sort of a sense of agency, whether it is through my congregation or through my activism or through the privilege that I have for working for the New Israel Fund at a time where I think Israel needs it most, is for me now a placeholder, where hope is so elusive and so far away for so many people. And again, I am privileged, I'm safe, 2 sons in the army, and they're both safe, thank God, for now. And bemet, I know that I could be running to the shelter every 5 minutes and I'm not, and that I don't have to plan which pajamas to wear every evening because I don't meet my neighbors downstairs in the shelter every night like other people in other parts of Israel do. So I really know that I'm privileged in many, many ways, but still hope is is so far away from me now, and action and just speaking up for what I believe in and for the way I envision Israel and the way I think it can be. And also taking into account what you said about seeing a people and not their leaders. It's a huge leap to make vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Huge leap for people who we are afraid of. We're even afraid to hear Arabic on the street And people respond to that in scary ways because they're scared. And I think to make that leap, to work on yourself, to just, have the energy to continue to disagree to the things you disagree with, and to continue to keep your values. It's not even, the political party that you identify with, because they're kind of a mishmash now. And also because we try to be, or we have to be, totally nonpartisan. It's about values, and it's about agency and action now more than anything. And that's what I'm trying to cling to. And I hear in what you're saying about your reality, that that's what you're going to, need to sort of prepare to do for the next, for when it's like you have us in mind and yourselves in mind, and you worry about, like a good Jewish people, you worry about us and you worry about yourselves at the same time. And it takes so much, and hope is so far away. And I feel like action and keeping at it, keep on keeping on,
I say to my students all the time, they're probably sick of me saying it, but I keep saying it, that hope is a spiritual practice. It's not easy. It's something that we have to work to maintain. And because hope in itself is not a strategy, the action is the strategy. The action is what we have to do, but the hope is what motivates us to keep doing it. The belief that it's worth it, that there is something that could change. We're not so far away from the Yamim Naraim, from the days of awe, where we said Psalm 27 every single day for 50 days, right? For the whole month leading up to the high holidays and all the way through. And it's the whole thing is about, how do we hold on to hope when the world is so hard, when we're experiencing so much loss and so much fear? And you hear it throughout the words of that psalm, that interplay of, how do we still believe that we can ask to dwell in the house of God, even when we feel the enemies around us, even when we feel so abandoned by everybody who should be taking care of us. And yet we still try to convince ourselves to take hope in God, to keep hoping, not because that's instead of doing anything. It's because we need something to motivate us to keep going. I really, really believe that, but it's some of the hardest spiritual work we can do.
I think we're at time. Ellie, tell us if it's time for questions, and if there are any questions.
I mean, this is a first and only that you guys are actually a little early. It's never happened before, so thank you.
So
but I think, oh, yeah, go.
No, I have a question for you, Shira, and if there's still questions coming in. What is helpful to hear from us, from your friends in the US? When are there things that you hear from American Jews where you're like, oh, just we don't need to hear it. We don't want to hear that from you. We have enough problems. And what are the things that you hear that are either helpful or comforting or challenging in a good way? What do you want from us?
First of all, I want for you to be resilient for yourselves. Really, you've had us, as I said, in your hearts and on your minds, and for so long you've been working for us, and you have to make sure that you have resilience for your own selves at this time. And I will say something. It's very hard for me to speak. I'm being totally frank, okay? To speak with ultra-Orthodox, or to hear ultra-Orthodox Israelis and ultra-Orthodox Jews from the US. And we have family in the US who belong to, more ultra settings. And as someone who believes in peace and who wants the war to end, and who has myself served in the army, and have a son in the reserves and a son in regular army service now, and multiple nephews and children of friends, and I just can't talk to people in the US and people in Israel who think that Torah is a magical protection to the Jewish people and equivalent to actually protecting ourselves. And I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that they're praying for us. I hear from family and friends in America who belong to these streams that they're davening, they're praying so hard. I don't want to belittle their prayer, but I can't hear that. It's like, don't pray for us, do something, you know? Talk to your families in Israel. Make sure they you know, it's not sustainable. And I'm not in so much conversation with ultra-Orthodox Israelis. It's just hard to see even people on the train. Sometimes I'm on the train, I want to get up and scream and say, why are you here now? Why are you here now and my son isn't? I mean, you know, it's just becoming really, really hard, even for someone who believes in ending the war. But when I hear from people in the US and that we're praying for you, it's like, don't pray for us, man. Don't pray for us. That's not what you need to do. Act, you know? And I pray, and you know, I believe in the power of prayer, but that's really difficult. I don't want to hear we're praying for you, okay? I'm sorry. And that's like just not helpful now. And the other thing I'm going to tread very, very carefully and say, private people in the US don't need to buy military equipment. Your country sends everything that we need all the time, including Air Force carriers and, you know, like the biggest pieces of everything we need for protection. And private people in Israel and in the United States shouldn't be buying helmets and vests and uniform for the IDF. And I want to say that when you're asked to buy military equipment, you're already buying it with your tax-paying dollars. And I'm already buying it with my tax-paying shekels. So these are two things that are a little difficult for me. We have a huge security budget. It doesn't have to be on you as private people, as Jews, as synagogues. And everything else that you do, the fact that you're still visiting, the fact that you just, you know, sometimes, Ayelet, you've written to me and said, I know you can't answer me now, but you're on my mind. And to understand that it's sometimes difficult for us because answering in English is hard, or because we're in the shelter texting with you, or because it's just been too much. I'm so grateful for when my loved ones in the United States just say, I have you on my mind. I'm with you. I see what you're doing. I see what you're going through. I understand that you can't answer me now at length or at all. That is so respectful of the situation we're at. So keep coming here. Keep us on your mind. Keep doing what you do to talk to your administration about supporting Israel in a sensible, reasonable, not unconditional way. And don't feel like you have to buy helmets because, you know, our being together is the real vest and helmet that doesn't cost any money.
Unless you're flying El Al, then it costs a lot of money.
It costs a lot of money. I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
But it's still good. Yeah. No, and you know, the Rabbinical Assembly is having our convention in Jerusalem in December. And I am really grateful that they decided to do that. It was a decision that was made, you know, very shortly after October 7th to move the convention to Israel, which had not initially been the plan, and to give people an opportunity to go and to be with our colleagues. And it's going to be, you know, I think about 200 conservative Masorti rabbis from all over the world, mostly from the US, are coming.
So important.
And part of the plan is to do some of the usual planning and learning and studying, but also we're doing 2 days in the field because it feels like such an important time to see different work that's happening in different places around the country, in culture, in Jewish learning, in activism and community building, and really get a sense of what people are doing every day.
Don't be afraid.
As you can imagine, we have all sorts of questions from all sorts of different parts of the spectrum and all sorts of, points and commentary. I'm just going to kind of go with a couple of the salient pieces. I think there's, people are pushing back a little bit, that there's a statement that, who are we negotiating with? What are the ways in which, if that's the most important part of a potential solution, how do we do that without fair partners? I don't know that that was our topic for today, but that is a pushback that we've received. Also, the sense that if Israeli soldiers don't have everything they need, shouldn't people be stepping up for what, that was also in that realm of pushback. So I guess the statement is, in this world in which there's so much room for divide, and actually one of our commentators, one of our audience members put this very nicely, how can we find paths towards embracing our common humanity and release our perceived boundaries? Because there are just so many of these walls, that any statement can be met with the complete counter statement at any given time. So where are the ways to find, Shira, you spoke very eloquently about the challenge you're having in talking across that a specific divide with ultra-Orthodox people. What are the ways in which you're finding opportunities to engage that divide and to build pluralistic communities?
Well, first and foremost, when there is an existing relationship, some sort of acquaintance from before, that's a lot to build on. Inside the Jewish community and across between Jews and Arabs inside Israel, if you already know someone, that's a place of trust, and that's a great place to start, I feel. And it's easier for me to be in conversation with someone who's different than me if I already have existing trust to begin with. We've done something together, we've been through something together, then we have some sort of a commitment and a shared starting point. And the second thing I feel is that when the conversation is about values, and are we sharing, or can we come together around values? It's very hard at a time of war to talk about values, and I guess that's what's come up in some of the pushback that you're describing, Ellie. Then a conversation around values is potentially somewhere that I can see myself crossing borders, and that could work. Existing trust, and to build from it and come together around talking about values and not about tactical priorities or, people, personas, specific politicians. I'd rather not, that's so explosive and can't contribute to a shared conversation.
I think we saw a similar phenomenon in interfaith relationships here in the US. I mean, certainly the time to try to meet your non-Jewish clergy neighbors was not on October 10th. We wanted to be with people we felt safe with. We wanted to be with people who reached out to see if we were okay, if our families were okay. And then a lot of rebuilding has had to happen because a lot of damage has been done in the last year. And it's certainly true for groups of multi-faith clergy who had, come together for years and years to do an MLK service or a Thanksgiving something or other to actually talk about the ways in which, a lot of Christian clergy did not show up for Jews this past year, and how to build those relationships on a really deep foundation, because you can't just lean on them when there's a crisis if there isn't a pre-existing sense of connection. One of the most moving things to me in New York, last fall, you started to see those empty Shabbat tables after the one outside of the Tel Aviv Museum at Hostage Square, and then in different cities all over the world. And in New York, we put one up in front of the Museum of Natural History on the Upper West Side, and a Protestant minister from a church that does a lot of partner work with some of the Jewish communities on the Upper West Side. She was there from the first minute until the last minute, schlepping and doing things. And it was so moving to me that she decided to spend her Friday that way with us.
People can be beautiful.
Ellie, you're muted.
Ellie, you're muted.
I realized after the fact, I think it goes back to that point of action and having, and being involved and engaged. And again, the relationships are the important piece. We're at time, so I really appreciate this conversation. It has been so lovely listening to both of you and to hear about this. I know this was a hard conversation, but I don't think there's any way to have this conversation right now without, getting into a lot of grief and sadness and frustration. So thank you for both being willing to share these kind of difficult feelings. And I'll wish Shira a Laila Tov and Ayelet a good afternoon. And thank you all for joining us. Next week, we're going to be looking backwards a bit. We're going to be exploring the biblical roots of the state of Israel with Professor Ben Sommer. And then actually in a couple of weeks on December 9th, this will be a special night session. Our last two sessions are in the evening. Rabbi Jan Urbach is going to be talking about communicating across divides, which I think really will build on a lot of the challenge that we are facing, not just in dealing with issues around Israel, but in American politics. If only I could have this ready for you for Thanksgiving in a couple of weeks, but it'll be here for Hanukkah. So thanks so much, and we hope you'll join us again.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ellie.
Shalom.